Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are getting back into Extreme Carnage with Extreme Carnage Toxin. And with us getting the return of Toxin from Planet of the Symbiotes and up to this point, not only does it seem like he's being restored back to his full power, but it's also quite possible that he could be approaching perfect symbiosis. And we'll talk about how shortly. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so for this one we go back a bit from where we had left off with part 5, and as we make our way through, there's a point where the cliffhanger will then intersect with the narrative and then just move on from there, because before we really get into the toxic team up portion, we first got to get into his most recent encounter with Carnage, which started off much like the rest as far as being broadcast through the television by messages from Senator Crane, but in this case with Toxin, he's not compelled as strongly as the others that we've seen, if at all really, and a lot of that stems back from Toxin being the 1000th symbiote and him being stronger, which at this point in time with him being bonded to Bren, there's really that question of how close is he to being back to his full potential. But with him acknowledging the drumbeat coming through Senator Crane's message, and instead of being uncontrollably compelled, he's more or less just like, what's that? Like he hears these drums but they're not booming. But with hearing this message from Crane, with them talking about the people needing protection and aliens being dangerous, and Bren's dad more or less agrees with that part, and when Bren asks him, is like that what you're doing at Alcomax, and his dad just brushes him off, and it's here where you kind of get this comment from Toxin where he notices the dynamic between Bren and his father, and he also notices that it's not the best, and when Toxin's kind of like, well, some dad you got there, I would know, and when he says that, I'm kind of like, between Carnage and Oscar, like, it's not really a comparison like that, because on one hand you got a serial killer versus a single dad who's like trying to do his best, and sure, he's not a great communicator, but he's not Carnage. But then it's here where we jump a lot closer to the more current events, but still closer around the time where Phage had attacked Alcomax. And when Brent, knowing that Alcomax has recently been attacked, he rushes to make his way down there out of concern for his dad, who he still believes is just a security guard. But when he says this, Toxin tells him like, look, ain't nobody at Alcomax just a security guard. And with saying this really to give Bren a heads up, because last time that they ran into a guardsman, it was pretty hectic. So just to kind of warn Bren and protect him, Toxin's more or less telling Bren to steer clear of the guardsman, more so than trying to talk him out of going to help his dad. But along the way there, Bren then calls for Toxin to come out so that they can swing there a lot quicker, but all of a sudden Toxin just goes silent. And it's right away from here where we then see Toxin in the void, and right away when he finds himself there and he hears the drums again, right away he knows he's dealing with Carnage. And he lets Carnage know, like, even if he didn't hear the drums, like the place is littered with his work, so it's pretty obvious that it's him. But since they've last met, Toxin was pretty sure that Eddie had killed Carnage, which was pretty much the ongoing belief since the conclusion of Absolute Carnage, but then that idea was debunked going into Venom Island. And really it's here where we find out that Toxin, he just wasn't aware of much of that, because the last time when he had faced Carnage, or really more so Carnage and Chthon, that battle had left Toxin weakened and to the point to where most had thought he was dead. But with Toxin actually hearing the voice of Carnage, that truly confirms that it is him, and Carnage responds letting him know that Eddie's way too busy to even sense what Carnage has been doing, with him being preoccupied on the universal level, and in Eddie's case likely even less now, with his recent changes and also his focus turning towards Dylan, with Dylan becoming the new Venom, which again is another one of those explanations to why we haven't seen either Dylan or Eddie at this point. But one of the things to check out here is like when Carnage tries to forcefully induct Toxin into his hive, and with doing this you can tell that Carnage is really trying to down talk or psych him out more or less, and he tries to tell him things like he's weak and he couldn't survive on his own, and really that's one of those things that just couldn't be further from the truth, because also with the last time that Toxin and Carnage had met up, to where Toxin was combined with both Jubilee Van Scotter's symbiote and the Wraith symbiote in order to stop Chthon, which eventually ended with what seemed to be the death of all three symbiotes, but as it appears Toxin was the only one who was able to recover, to where he had then eventually found Bren. But the fact that Toxin made it, even in a weakened state, like that alone should say something. But even with Carnage talking down Toxin's previous host and current host and telling Toxin how none of them had really given him a spine, and it's here where Toxin tells Carnage that him and Bren are more like a team rather than Carnage who's just like this crazed symbiote. But with saying that, like, it's here where I want to talk a bit about what's being set up, or at least what appears to be in the works here. Because in the case of the Carnage symbiote, to where with Cletus Cassidy, it was like your first example of perfect symbiosis. And Eddie in the beginning was close when he hated Peter Parker, but even at that time the Venom symbiote didn't hate Peter Parker. Like, it was pissed at him, but it didn't hate him. So with the Venom symbiote and Eddie combining that rage with hatred, their bond was way crazier and way stronger. But when the Venom symbiote gave birth to the Carnage symbiote and it then bonded with Cletus Cassidy, it was psycho, he was psycho, and that perfect symbiosis made him too much for either Venom or Spider-Man individually. But in the case of Toxin, who Carnage had feared from Toxin's birth, he's been a heavy threat even though he's never had perfect symbiosis. So imagine how much his power would buff in the event that he does. Because even when he was bonded initially with Patrick Mulligan, Carnage gave Mulligan the symbiote just to hold it for a while so he can kill him later. And even then after, between Toxin and Mulligan, it was more so the case of him trying to teach the symbiote to be good. But now we have the case of Bren Waters being the current host, and up to this point, there's been a bit of a heavy emphasis on the two of them having father issues, with Toxin's father being Carnage, and there's your issue right there, but then also Bren's issue with the communication with his dad, and him also being a guardsman, which feels like it's also building up to something later on. That's just gonna be super dramatic, and it's gonna bring Bren and Toxin even closer. And with that said, like once again, imagine Toxin at full power and with perfect symbiosis. Like he's gonna be a problem. And it really feels like we're walking the lines of seeing that being set up. But with Carnage continuing to threaten Toxin, and doing so with telling him things like, well, if he doesn't willingly join him, then he's gonna lobotomize him and make him do it, but that just doesn't happen. And instead, in mid-sentence, he just rips his jaw off. But again, with this taking place in the void, this is really more of a display of will more so than it is physical feats. But then also with Toxin putting up this fight this well, it is a bit of show of power, because naturally Carnage should be destroying Toxin here because the amount of time that him and Cletus has spent bonded together versus Toxin, who again is just learning everything as he goes and quite literally just hasn't been around as long. But with the two of them fighting back and forth in the void, Carnage then gives Toxin another ultimatum and he tells him to willingly join the hive, and with doing so, first eat Bren from the inside out, and if not, he'll hold Toxin here and Carnage will just do it himself. And for Bren, who's still trying to make his way to get to his dad, even though he's not able to hear Toxin, he does feel a bit of this struggle between Toxin and Carnage, but Bren just doesn't know what's going on. But just before Carnage can kind of make the decision for Toxin, and Toxin tells him right away, not this time, not with Bren. And from there, he just overthrows Carnage in the void, and he does so by eating him with the head that he had ripped off, and it effectively ends this whole encounter. And in the case of Carnage, though he lost here during this match in the void, he then tells Toxin that he's going to be a part of the bloodbath to come. And Toxin just lets him know, like, if he beat him here, then he'll beat Carnage on the outside too. But really, we know that's something that's not quite guaranteed, because in the void, you have your place where some may have their advantages, like someone's codex for example, who may be able to maneuver through the void, but then otherwise in the real world, they would then need a significant amount of help. And in the case of Toxin, that may be just his host, Bren, or it'll be the collective effort from the others. But even with seeing this at this point, I'm not really sure if Toxin's at 100%. But after this, then going to Bren as he makes his way over to Alcomax, and as soon as he gets there, he sees his father being taken out on a stretcher. And at this point, his dad's been taken out of his armor, so it's not like he's in his guardsman suit. And so when Bren runs up to him and he tells him that a symbiote that did this, Bren still doesn't even know. And when he directly asks his father if he is a guardsman, his dad pretty much just denies it. And not even so much in the way of outright just lying about it, but he deflects the question and he tells Bren, like, you think I need one of them green suits? When apparently he does, because if he didn't have one, he'd be dead. Like, let's just be honest here, like, I'm gonna call a spade a spade. But while they're having this conversation here, back inside the void, Toxin, he can hear this whole thing. And like we've seen before, Toxin, he has his suspicions of Brent's father being a guardsman, and he also hears Brent telling him, like, man, I wish Toxin was here, because if he was, then Brent can truly tell if his father was lying. Or better yet, that his father was lying, because he was lying. He was definitely lying. But then after this, then jumping over to DC, it's here where we catch up with Flash's buddy Hank, who at this point is giving Flash the update as far as Carnage planning his attack at the President's Monument during the huge For Humanity rally. But even still at this point, he still hasn't figured out what exactly is going on with Crane, which I think is pretty obvious. But even with him reporting to Flash, he has to cut it short because he figures out that he's been made. And when this happens, Hank just tells Flash to meet him at the rally, but then it's also here where we find out that the person who was following Hank is actually Agony, because even with Hank having his suspicions of Crane and possibly aware of Phage, but even still at this point he's unaware of Agony and even Lasher for that matter. But then it's after this when we go back to the void with Toxin, who's pretty much feeling himself right now after beating Carnage, and even to the point where he's calling it his void. But then it's while he's here where he then sees a glimmer of light, to where with doing so he sees it as like a trespasser in his space. And it's pretty much here where we pick up from the cliffhanger where we ended it in part 5, but with the way that it's done, it's not exactly like a one-to-one, but it works. And really, I'm not too hung up about it because this stuff happens, but usually within tie-ins rather than consecutive issues in a series. But either way, it still works because it's here where Toxin makes his way back to Bren and he catches him up on everything that had happened in the void, telling him Carnage had sent Phase to Alcomax. But then once again, they kind of have that dad moment because Toxin then apologizes for Brent's dad getting caught up in his dad's crossfire, but he then goes on to let Bren know that he believes that he's found some help and is here with doing so to where he takes Bren into the void. But when he does this, at this point in time, both Flash and Andy are already there. And in this case, Andy's investigation is shown a bit differently, with her more or less walking Flash through the whole process of her trying to figure out what's going on. And in this case, while they're still in the void, Toxin and Bren then pop up, and it's here where both sides kind of share the intel of their experiences with Toxin just running around telling everybody like, I whooped Carnage ass. I just wanted you to know how you been. Like he just couldn't wait to tell him. And like for me, it really gives off this vibe to where Toxin is just ready to be back. Like there's a part of him that's just ready to have that power back. But then also you got the case of Toxin just letting them know that he's alive and him filling them in on that part after he's gotten the important stuff out of the way. Like imagine this guy just being dead for years, or you thinking he's been dead for years, and then he just comes back greeting you like that. But with them all getting caught up here, like Flash lets them know like beating him in the void, that's one thing, but facing Carnage in DC, like that's a whole nother story. But then shortly after this, they all exit the void, group up, and they then make their way to DC so they can link up with Hank and meet him at Crane's rally. And of course, at this point, to make their way there, instead of web slinging, they just take to the skies. Which really, since King in Black, I feel like the wings has just been a great addition, because imagine web slinging across country or something like that. Like just taking flight makes way more sense. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. If anyone is new here and you want more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so we can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.